Hey there.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good.
Feeling good?
Absolutely.
You had a good time with your son?
Yeah. Yeah.
Bringing him home?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
He looks good.
He's doing good. Yeah. He's working today.
Wow.
So he's living here and then commuting over to Port Hueneme.
Is he waiting to get a new place there?
Yeah. We're looking for apartments for him.
Oh, so he's not going to live on the base anymore?
Right. He decided he wants to live in an apartment.
But where he was living before, I thought that was on the base, right?
Yes. But that's barracks, and then you're sharing a room, and under their jurisdiction, you have to make your beds, et cetera, et cetera. He wants to live on have his own place.
He wants to not make his bed every day. Is what
That's right.
I don't want to make my bed every day.
I understand. I get that. No. Is there a big difference in cost for not having to make your bed every day?
Well, he gets like a $2,000 monthly stipend that if he stays in, he has an apartment, he pays for that. He's on base. He gets the money himself.
Gotcha.
But he wants the independence.
Yeah, but he also doesn't want a roommate, right?
That's true.
Yeah, that's the main thing.
Yeah.
I don't blame him for that.
Or at least not a roommate that you don't get to have any say over.
Right.
Yeah, I get it. Now I don't know.
I like my roommate though, Rabbi.
You do? You like your roommate? Listen, I don't know what I can do, but we can talk to my brother-in-law, Charles, who works for the city of Port Hueneme, and see if he can free up a building or something for him. So I'll get on Chaz. I'll get on Chaz to see whether he can do anything for Dave and his. We're glad that Dave is back. Did he have any good stories to tell of his last time at Okinawa?
No. I mean, they're kind of restricted to being on base, so that was less enjoyable. He did go out occasionally do some expeditions and seeing places, but he was anxious to be back. And then the trip over, he's supposed to be live on Monday. They had like a 12-hour delay, so they're stuck in Alaska airport for a day. So Monday became Tuesday.
I saw that. So, he did not have a fun return.
No.
But there's a lot of people dealing with that right now, right? With travel. Was it? Do you think it was travel COVID related? That's
right.
Why it was like that?
The staff that was supposed to do the plane had shortages of people, and they had to wait for the next crew to come in, and that was the next day.
Right.
So yeah, it was indirectly COVID related.
So, and you're saying that because of COVID, they also didn't get to go off base. That must be kind of frustrating too, right?
Right. Yeah, a little bit limiting.
Yeah.
Right. You kind of knew that.
Well, we're very appreciative of his service and his work. In the Navy. How many years has he been now in the Navy?
9, starting a 9th year.
Wow.
He's obviously making a career out of it, Jeff.
We think so. At least going into 20, but
he's definitely halfway. He's pretty close to halfway there. So
yeah.
No, that's good. It's good that he's found something he enjoys, and he works hard, and he gets to serve his country, which I know is really a big part of your guys' family, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, that's good.
Well, we have another veteran actually on the line right now. We have John, who's serving with the Marines, and actually have a service today for a Marine who served during World War II. He didn't serve overseas, and he was kind of young when he went in, but he's in his 90s. I mean, unfortunately, he passed. He was in his 90s, but there's going to be a military honors for him. And I had a service 2 weeks ago for a guy who was in the Army Air Corps when it was still not the Air Force back in World War II. So yeah, we're losing some of our last vets from World War II, and I'm noticing that in those cases, the guys are a little bit we're a little less likely to be stationed overseas. And it's making sense because these guys, entered the military when they were 17, 18 years old, right out of high school. And, they were born in like 25, 26. And so by the time they went in, they were they were not the first to necessarily serve because they were on the younger side. I was looking at something, and some of you know this, but the average age of the servicemen in World War II was 26 because of universal conscription. And I know my grandfather served, and he was on the upper end. He was like on the 26, 27.
Kenny's father served, and I think he was overseas.
Yeah, he was. I think Ken was Ken's dad. Yeah.
Dan, yeah.
But my grandfather was overseas. He was in India, but I think that, the older guys, they tended to move those guys first overseas. And, people have talked about it. The average age of military servicemen in Vietnam was 19. But the difference, of course, was that, people would get drafted into their 30s in World War II. And so there's a big age.
And my dad missed World War II, I think by a year or so. He was too young to go. He went to Korea. He was older in Korea.
Yeah, and because there was still universal conscription in Korea, there was still a pretty high rate of Jewish men that served. And of course that went down as as universal conscription went away. The rate went down. And that's why, when we have Jewish guys like John and Dave that are serving, it's a really great thing because it became less frequent and less common for Jewish guys to have that experience. But there was a time when every Jewish man, because of conscription, and they didn't avoid it, they didn't, for the most part, they didn't try to run away from their service. That was an experience that many Jewish men went through. And so it's definitely, it changed over the last 40, 50 years, obviously. But it's an honor when somebody has when someone's passed and there's a military guard for them. That's a pretty, to me, it's a pretty sacred part of the service. And again, we have another one today for a man who served in the Marines, Donald Weston, who's going to be laid to rest today. So after this,
John, how long have you been in the service now?
I haven't been in for a long time.
Oh, you retired?
Yeah, I served 9 years, but 3 active and 6 reserve.
Good for you.
That was a long time ago.
My uncle was the Marine for, I want to say he was in 30 years actually. And he was always a Marine though, because he worked for helped the retirees out and all that down in San Diego.
Yeah, and it's a noble decision to do government service.
He loved it.
If you can put up with all the stuff that comes along with it.
Exactly. That's what he used to say.
Never stop being a Marine. You're never not a Marine. So that's
right.
Why
no, that's true. It's in my DNA, and sometimes to my detriment.
Well, we've got. It's great to have everybody here this morning. I was thinking as I outed my that doesn't even sound right, but as I outed myself as someone who is now officially amongst the COVID those who've been hit by COVID, I feel absolutely fine, and that's why even saying it, I felt like I was not fishing for sympathy because there was no sympathy needed, but I was letting people know that in the midst of us feeling a lot of us feeling either sick, which I did. I mean, I felt like a cold, but feeling sick or just feeling like, we're now in the midst of another freeze to our lives. A lot of people have put travel on hold, have put their plans on hold. And in some cases they don't even have a choice because things have been shut and things like that. But, we're trying to maintain, a level of normalcy, kids are at school, things like that. But to have to go through what we did this last weekend, was obviously very upsetting. The outcome in this situation was obviously in Texas was about as good as it could possibly have been. And it's, it is what it is. But at the end of the day, it reminds us, and you've seen their articles, and there's another article in the New York Times today about how scary it is to be Jewish right now. This was a reminder, and unfortunately, because of the last attacks primarily have been the result of kind of what we call white supremacists or again, from identifiably non-Muslim sites. Now that there was a Muslim inspired act of hate, that it reminds us that, again, this is what a lot of people in Europe, a lot of people in other parts of the world are worried primarily about, this type of hate rather than kind of neo-Nazi fascist hate, that this was from the other side. So it reminded us that, again, and there have been other attacks. I want to make it clear, there have been other attacks that have been generated from Islamic, from that side already. They just haven't been as frequent, and they haven't been the ones that have been most recent. So it was definitely upsetting, and it was, again, another kind of reminder that we have to be careful, and there's a lot of work we have to do to make our world safe. And again, when Jews are attacked, it usually means that, there's going to be other acts of hate. We're not the only ones that are going to be, attacked and targeted. So it's it is what it is, my friends. And so I'm glad everybody's here. I'm glad, we're missing some people, but it's good to have some faces, at least we can see on Zoom. And so Reverend Lynn is here. As one of our other, one of my colleagues in faith. What were any thoughts that you had as you were watching? Needless to say, this is like the nightmare for every clergy, that thing that happens. So any thoughts that you had as you were watching news unfold on Saturday?
Well, I of course was terrified like everyone else. It seems, all of this seems just never ending. One of the things afterward that I found fascinating was that they'd all had some sort of training that prepared them for this. And I was very impressed with that. The rabbi throws a chair at the guy and they all make a beeline for the door. Are you working on your chair throwing?
Something that also, by the way, I don't want to brag or anything like that, but that's like the fantasy. I don't want to brag, but it's actually, the fantasy that you can disable
Right.
the bad guy and get everybody out. I don't know. Listen,
Right.
Judith knows. I just have been wanting to call everybody good wife. Good wife Stolnitz knows that. Goody Stolnitz knows that. I don't know why I said that. I just want to call everybody by their Puritan pilgrim names. She knows that
DAR, that's us.
her husband has.
That's Daughters of the American Revolution.
Well, I'm going back even further. But good wife Goody Watson actually sounds like a character from The Crucible. So there might have been a good. But
Goody Stolnitz doesn't quite do it.
I just like it. It's just so funny. But her husband Mark took me to has taken me shooting a few times. It's been a little while, and I would say that they're not necessarily him, but there are those who've encouraged me to get my carry and conceal. And again, that's kind of like somehow I'm gonna save the congregation. That's the weird kind of
Mark, I want to know right now, are you packing heat?
just while I'm on Zoom.
What about the crossbow and the rabbits?
Listen, I'm trained, but the reality is I do not have I shouldn't say anything of what I do or don't have, but but I don't have it yet. Every time something like this happens, I think more seriously about it. But I also really do think that unless that firearm is in a place where I can get to it real quick in services, it's not going to help. So it is something that I.
And
Right
the
on the
trouble is,
demon,
so
Rabbi.
can other people.
What? What was that, Lynn?
Right on the Bima, Rabbi.
Yeah. No, Lynn, you said
Have
something.
you had an active shooter at your congregation? I mean, a training for active shooters?
Did we have a training? No, we've had informal training, and we actually were supposed to have one in that a member of another synagogue was putting together, where I actually would have gotten my CNC license, and it ended up being postponed and canceled because of COVID, actually. But I don't listen, folks. I'm first of all, this isn't the forum to get into it necessarily now, and I will tell people that we've had training. We've had the CSI training, or I've had the CSI training from our local our federation, or LA Federation. We're very lucky, actually. I just want to let everybody know that not only are we not only are these people that that we're in contact with, the people who actually run the Federation's community service initiative, the CSI. I know CSI, everybody thinks it's, but CSI is actually the community service initiative for us. That is, they actually, the two gentlemen who run it, the man who runs it, Jason, and his assistant is also Jason. They both live in Santa Clarita, so they actually work at the Federation, but they live in Santa Clarita. They both live nearby. They're both former military. One of them has special ops training, and they're both real close. Not that that's necessarily going to help in in a crisis, but we have a really close relationship, and I probably have worked with them more than most of the other rabbis or synagogues, just because they're in close proximity, and it goes back to stuff with Einstein and the fact that these guys we have a friendship. So we're kind of lucky that they're also, like I said, in our own backyard, and they want to make sure their local synagogue, even though they're not Jewish, they want to make sure that we're in good shape. So we're lucky in that way, but we don't have the resources, and we don't have we've obviously have much better security than we did 5 years ago, but we don't have the resources that these other places do have. But we do have cameras going 24/7. We do have and it's tape, it's being taped. It's and we do, as have better security fencing than we used to. So that being
When
said,
I was teaching, the police came, and I was teaching in South Central, and we were to come up with a scenario that when someone broke into our room with a gun, the story that we would tell, what we would say. Well, I had that happen, and I always taught with my doors open just because I'm nosy. We're supposed to keep the doors closed, but this woman runs in with blood streaming out of her mouth. The kids dive under their desks, and it was a really brilliant lesson plan that day, which was shot to hell. But
So to speak.
she said that her boyfriend, lover, whoever, was chasing her with a gun, and she wanted to hide in my room. I said, well, he'll find you here. Run out of the other door and down the stairs. He doesn't know there's stairs there. She said, okay, and ran out the door. I closed both doors and called the office.
oh my God.
I mean, we had shootouts, we had all sorts of stuff.
Oh yeah, that is, listen, there is that unfortunate reality though now, in that, look, this synagogue that got attacked, was chosen because it was close to the airport, but it's the same size congregation as ours. It's a tiny community. It's not a big community. It was not like, I got news for you, I never heard of it. The shooting in Poway kind of reminded us there's no there's no safety from being in, one of the safest parts of LA County. It's just the feelings like that we used to feel like, man, that ain't gonna happen here. After the Saugus shooting, folks, I gave up any illusion that Santa Clarita is any safer or going to be any less liable to be a place of safety that everyone's surprised. That surprise won't be. I can't be there. So
St. Stephen's now has security fencing. Wow. And an entrance system.
Well, my friends, lest anybody forget, from where most of us are sitting right now, one of the scariest, and again, it wasn't the most deadly, but potentially deadly attacks ever on a Jewish institution happened 22 years ago. And the attack at the North Valley JCC, the fact that people didn't die there is only a miracle, because of the amount of rounds that went off at that shooting, and the fact that they were children who, some of them that were struck should have bled out. It is not, I don't use the term miracle a lot. And I was at Holy Cross when those kids came, even before some of the parents came, and I talked to the doctors there. They freely used the word miracle when they said they have no idea how they didn't have fatalities. And the man who was one of the first people in that place, Todd Karb, who's a member of our temple, who's a member of the paramedic, he's a retired paramedic. He told me he walked that place literally right after it happened. The amount of spent shells, the shell casings, it was unbelievable. And
I was working at the church next door at St. Andrew and St. Charles.
Wow.
Yeah.
That day?
I had the day off. But yeah. Boy, it just, the phone calls were just incredible.
Folks, that happened it didn't happen in Santa
Clarita. Is that why JCC closed up there? No.
It closed because they didn't have funds. They didn't.
I love that place. As a kid, we used to go there all the time.
Yeah, that was the JCC that I went to preschool at. So yeah, it was tough. And again, that happened in our community. So lest we forget that it can happen. It did happen, folks. I mean, it's not like we have to dream about it or not have a nightmare about it. The nightmare happened. I mean, it's not theoretical. So I'm happy. What?
We had one in San Bernardino when I was working at Emmanuel, and that's a big glass building. And the rabbi and I were trying to figure out where would we hide the kids. Do you remember when they had the shootout with they were Muslim?
Yes.
Husband and wife.
Yes.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden we had the SWAT team all around us and everything. It was just, but we should have figured out a place to hide the children before this had happened.
And that synagogue is no longer there.
Yeah.
Not because of that. They moved further out to the desert, out to Beaumont. But yeah, it's a fear that we all have, unfortunately. Let's get to the text. And I do want to tell people that just last week when we began the book of Samuel, I shared with you a little bit about the book and the fact that there's two books, but there originally wasn't that, the Hebrew versions don't divide it up into 1st, 2nd Samuel. There is no break naturally. There also aren't, as we talked about, chapters and verses were put in by Christian scholars and we kind of kept them. And so you're going to see actually some weird breaks in this that don't quite make sense. But, again, it's because the chapter and verse was broken a little differently. I also mentioned that the text copies that we have of Samuel, ironically, are not very good. And the fact that we know that, well, part of it you'll see in this case, because you'll see a lot of times in the book of Samuel, in this translation we have, it'll say meaning of Hebrew uncertain. And the reason that it says that is because there are words missing. We know that the copy of Samuel that we have in the Hebrew Bible is not a good copy. The reason we know that is because not only we see these things that seem to be missing, but we have the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Bible that the church used. And we saw that there were differences between the Septuagint and the book of Samuel. Some of them seem to be interpretations and explanations that were put in by the Greek translators. And so they were not part of the original Hebrew, but other parts of it seemed like, well, that seems to be a different copy of the text. And, it was kind of difficult to know which one was the right one, whether it was the Septuagint, the Greek, or whether it was the Hebrew, what we call the Masoretic text, the MT, the one that we have, the Hebrew Bible that we have. And so there was debates about it and kind of a lot of unknowns until, as we discussed last week, we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found several copies of the book of Samuel, because the Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection, a library of books and mainly the Bible. And we have the book of Samuel there. We have 4 different copies of Samuel, and not the whole book. We don't have a whole book of Samuel, but we have enough scrolls of Samuel to notice that, that copy from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which again is at least 2,000 years old, we saw some things in there that seemed to indicate that the Septuagint was actually had a better version of Samuel than the Hebrew Bible did. And so when it's appropriate and we kind of can get some help from it, we'll look at that. I'll show you where those things are. And it's not major stuff. I want to make it clear. There's not new people that are introduced. There are not, missing, stories. It's not at that level. In most cases, it's a word or two, but sometimes the word or two actually kind of gives us a better understanding. I will tell you that usually from the context, we kind of knew what was there anyways. And so it's not like, this gave us, and that's why we don't talk about it that much, because in the scheme of things, it really wasn't that important, but it is important from the standpoint of acknowledgement that, that the texts are that there were sometimes scribal errors. At the same time, my feeling is when you've copied texts over for 3,000 years, and that's literally what we're talking about with the biblical text. Some of them go back 3,000 years. You expect that there's occasionally going to be a scribal error over 3,000 years. For the most part, the Dead Sea Scrolls prove to us that the scribal errors are very, very minimal. They're a little problematic for people who are devoutly Orthodox to admit, because if there are scribal errors, then it's not necessarily exactly the word of God, right? That there's been some human imprint on it, if you will, at the very least. But from my standpoint, it actually says that we've done a really good job of making sure that the text is copied accurately, and that there was a great emphasis on making sure that the text was copied verbatim. So that being said, we read the first 2 chapters and we were introduced to Samuel. The interesting thing about Samuel is that he, like a lot of the early stories from the patriarchs, he's a gift from God. He literally was an answer to his mother's prayer. His mother, Hannah, prayed for him. She couldn't have a baby. And she says, if I have a baby, I'm going to dedicate him to God. She has the baby, and she does indeed bring him to, at the time, the temporary temple, which was in Shiloh, not too far from Jerusalem. And actually going to be a theme for today that we're going to read about, the fact that this the ark and the tabernacle, the tent around it, was not in a permanent home, but it does seem like Shiloh, it was there for a while, and it seems like the building actually was more than just a tent, that there was fixed buildings around it, and that there was that it had found a comfortable home in Shiloh, if not a permanent home, pretty semi-permanent, and that the people there were very comfortable with having it there. But it's definitely a theme for today. That you're going to see that's what we're going to read about. What we also learned about at the end of last week, which is really important for this week, is that Eli, the head priest at the time, who's a descendant of Ithamar, of Aaron's son, on that side, that his own sons are not good people. And so it says that Eli was old, and he heard his sons were doing what they were doing to Israel, and that they would lay with the women who performed tasks at the entrance of the tent of meeting. He said to him, he confronted his sons, "Why do you do such things? I get evil reports." And he said, "Don't, my sons. It is no favorable report I hear from the people." And he confronts them, and they say, well, they don't say anything, but they ignored their father's plea. And it says the Lord resolved that they should die. And then it says, it finishes with, "But Samuel grew in esteem and favor, both with God and with men." And so Samuel is doing the right thing while Eli's own sons are doing the wrong thing. Seems like not an uncommon or unknown theme where a man's own children are messing up, and there's a guy working for the dad that does the right thing, and his own sons are off, taking advantage of their dad's job. That's what happened. That's the story. That's Eli and Samuel. Samuel is the dutiful worker, and the guy's own sons are messing around in a big way. I mean, a really big way. And what we finish with is that it says a man of God comes to Eli and says, you're done. I'm going to take away everything. And a time is coming when I'll break your power and that of your father's house, and there shall be no elder in your house. I shall cut off your offspring from my altar. They're done. And the man of God says, your sons, Hophni and Pinchas, they'll die on the same day. And I'll raise up for myself a faithful priest. So all of these things seem to indicate now to Eli that this is not good. And we already know that he's older. And that's where we pick up the story today, which is we're going to see the story of Samuel. We're going to read two stories today, a story of Samuel being called, if you will. And then we're going to see literally, and then we're going to see the story of the ark. And, we talk about the Lost Ark. This is the first time the ark gets lost, the first time it gets taken. So we all know the ark is lost right now, but it was actually lost earlier. And that's what we're going to read about now. So this is the Lost Ark the first time. It's an interesting story of how it comes back. So that's what we're going to read today. So I'm going to turn it over to Goody Watson with the reading today.
Young Samuel was in the service of the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. Prophecy was not widespread.
So wait, let's pause right there, because we just read about a prophet or an angel perhaps coming to Eli and telling them stuff. So we just read about a story, but it's now the Bible literally steps back and says, but it didn't happen a lot. And, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it indicative of a time when God doesn't have to speak to people, or which is maybe a good thing that things, God doesn't have to remind people what to do, or is an indicator of, but people are so messed up that God doesn't even bother speaking to anybody. And that's an interesting, question to think about, because we know, again, for those who are with us in the book of Judges, you saw with your own eyes what was going on during the time of Judges. This is the time of Judges. This is the last period of Judges that it overlaps with the time of the Kings, or it's going to go into the time of Kings with Samuel overlapping. But Samuel's considered the last judge. I mean, we consider him the last judge. And what's interesting is that it seems to be that, again, this period is a time when God did not speak to people much through prophecy. So, and God was not talking to people very often.
One day, Eli was asleep in his usual place. His eyes had begun to fail, and he could barely see. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was sleeping in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. The Lord called out to Samuel, and he answered, "I'm coming."
Okay, so Eli is asleep, and it also tells us that he couldn't see. And it also says that this happens in a time of the night when, by the way, this is the lamp of God had not yet gone out. I mean, was the lamp of God that it says the Ner Elohim? That doesn't say the menorah, but maybe it's the menorah, maybe it's some other type of light that was in the area, in the holy area, that was lit at night. Maybe there was a night light, so to speak, that was on, that illuminated it, not during the day. The menorah might have been lit all the time, but there was this other light that, kept things on at night. But God calls to Samuel at this time, and it says, Vayikra Adonai el Shmuel, and then he says, Vayomer Hineni. He doesn't say, I'm coming. So
He says, "Hineni, here I am."
this is another example of the Bible translation not giving us the word that we need to have, which is at least, my feeling is whenever the word Hineni comes up in the Bible, mark it, let people know that that's what it says, put a little footnote that says Hineni, because that's what Samuel says when he hears the word. Just keep in mind, again, this word in the Bible that goes all the way back to Abraham, and Abraham, is the first person to say Hineni. It is the word that, essentially God is asking us to say. It's translated as I'm here, I'm present. In this case, it's translated as I'm coming. But it means, yes, I'm ready to do something. And oftentimes it means I'm ready to do something I really don't want to do, which again seems to be the case in some cases when Moses says it, or when more probably powerfully when Joseph says it to Jacob and is sent off to go, try to find his brothers. When Joseph says Hineni there, he's kind of recognizes that this might be a suicide mission I'm going on. So it's important in this story, because this story, and again, we recently read it in our Wednesday night class, because we read the Akedah. Abraham says it 3 times to God. When God says, come and take your son, he says it to his son when Isaac says father, and he says Hineni, and then he says it to the angel, and the angel calls him. So Abraham said it 3 times. This is a key word here too in Samuel's. So let's take a look at Samuel's call, if you will.
He ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But he replied, "I didn't call you, go back to sleep." So he went back and lay down.
And so he said it again. He ran to Eli and says, Hineni. So he said it out loud when he was in bed, he says Hineni. Then he runs to Eli because he thinks Eli called him, and he says, now we know the Lord called him. So we already know who called Samuel, but Samuel doesn't know who called him. So that when he runs to Eli and says Hineni, that indicates that he doesn't know who called him. So he goes back and lays down. And then it says,
Again, the Lord called Samuel. Samuel rose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But he replied, "I didn't call my son. Go back to sleep." Now, Samuel had not yet experienced the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him.
now that's the interesting line, because now the narrator, the Bible now tells us Samuel didn't know. This was his first experience with God. So he didn't know what God would sound like. He didn't know that this is what was happening, which is why he has this. And it's almost a comic. It is really almost a comic situation, right? Where he hears the voice and he thinks Eli, and he keeps running out. He does it 2 times. He runs out and says, hey, Hineni, I'm here. What do you need? And we know that Eli is blind, so he's helping a man that he respects and admires, he works for. And if the guy calls him, he might need to go to the bathroom, whatever he needs, he's got to help him. The guy's blind. So it's an interesting and maybe again even a humorous scene, because Samuel is being called by God and he thinks it's a person calling him. He thinks it's this his mentor, his surrogate father, even to some extent, Eli calling him. So this is this miscommunication, if you will. And here we have.
The Lord called Samuel again a 3rd time, and he rose and went to Eli and said, here I am, you called me. Then Eli understood that the Lord was calling the boy. And Eli said to Samuel, go lie down. If you are called again, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And Samuel went to his place and lay down.
So let's just consider this scene for a second, because 3rd time's the charm, right? The 3rd time is the time where Eli finally realizes what's going on, that it must be God that's calling him. That Samuel definitely hears a voice, and now he knows that God is talking to him. Maybe Samuel doesn't, but Eli does. Now, just consider that scene for a second, because, we just had 9 verses of the Bible dedicated to a scene which could have been summarized by saying God called Samuel, and Samuel thought it was Eli, but Eli told him it wasn't. That's what it could have said. Instead, we have this back and forth.
It's building suspense. Now you really want to hear what God is going to say.
Yep. And you realize too that by Eli essentially, and again, is it comical? Is there some funny element, or is it a powerful element, whatever you want to say, that Eli has now been woken up three times from his sleep. Yeah. And at this point, now Eli knows that God is talking to Samuel. It's not just that God talked to Samuel, it's that God talked to Samuel, or Samuel in either intentionally or unintentionally has now made Eli know that God is talking to him. Because now Eli knows, even if he goes back to sleep, in the back of his mind, God is talking now to my assistant, my non-genetically connected to me assistant, that now God is talking to him. And this, if anything, at some point, now must make Eli recognize Samuel. If he didn't recognize it before, Samuel has the gift, if you will. And so Samuel is now, and Samuel has essentially announced himself as a prophet before he's even heard the word. That's essentially what's happened. Because
it's also a contrast to the other boys.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, God is talking to this guy, but not to my sons. So, and look, Eli is aware enough, either because God had been speaking to him. A man of God definitely spoke to him, but did God speak to him too at night? In visions? We don't know. But the fact is that he now knows, whatever the case, whether God is still speaking to him, God never spoke to him. Eli knows what's happening. Eli is now aware of what's happening, and then tells Samuel what to do. And so if he didn't speak to God, if Eli hadn't been speaking to God, Eli knew the ritual. Eli knew what a man what a prophet was supposed to do, which is to say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So that's the phrase that people would say, Daber Adonai ki shama avdecha, that I'm listening, that your servant is listening even. It's even more powerful than I'm listening, that your servant, because you're literally putting yourself in a subservience, an obeisance to God, to say, I'm listening and I'm your servant. I'm your servant. So now this is the call.
The Lord came and stood there, and he called us before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel answered, speak, for your servant is listening. The Lord said to Samuel, I am going to do in Israel such a thing that both ears of anyone who hears about it will tingle. In that day, I will fulfill against Eli all that I spoke concerning his house from beginning to end. And I declare to him that I sentence his house to endless punishment for the iniquity he knew about, how his sons committed sacrilege at will, and he did not rebuke them. Assuredly, I swear concerning the house of Eli, that the iniquity of the house of Eli will never be expiated by sacrifice or offering.
Wow. So what is this first message that Samuel gets? His first message.
That Eli and his house are beyond saving. They can't even atone for what they've done.
Yep. Now, we've already heard, and that's why I wanted to take a moment to show you before we started, that Eli knew what was going on. Not only did he know what was going on, he confronted his kids and warned them. And so he did take that step. It's not like he ignored it, but he didn't
impose any consequences.
There was no consequences. Yeah. Now, what's so powerful about this is that this harkens back to Aaron's own sons. And we're only talking a couple generations removed from Aaron, that Nadav and Avihu went on, and again, what they did didn't seem to be anywhere near as bad as what these guys did, because these guys not only took advantage of their portion, we read about them taking the best meat off of the offerings, but they were also sleeping with the women that were working at the temple. There's like no level there. They've offended God. They've sinned against God and man. So they're really bad. And Samuel is in a really bad situation, because now he's been told that his boss's family is going to get wiped out. We have to assume that, and it doesn't say exactly what Samuel did during this time when his boss's sons were warned. It doesn't say what Samuel was doing, but we have to assume that, it was not a comfortable position for Samuel, because again, he's not part of the family, but now he's being told this information. I mean, what is he going to do? Because, he's not part of the family, and he admires, he respects, he's been, raised by Eli, and now he's basically been told this information. And I mean, I don't care how old you are or how you associate with this story. This is not a good position for a young man to be in. This is
how old is Samuel?
Well, that's a good question, right? So we don't know exactly how old he is at this point. We have to assume he's not married yet. And I will tell you, there's a very cruel twist of fate in store for Samuel, by the way, which we will get to very quickly, because we do read about Samuel having a family. I won't ruin the story, but you can probably imagine what happens to Samuel. But so this is a really bad situation for someone to be in, to be basically told that your boss is done, and it's bad. I mean, it's not just that he's going to lose his business. I mean, they're done. And that, the people who should be inheriting the business, they're done. They're not out of business. They're dead. It's a really bad situation. At the very minimum, it's an uncomfortable situation, but I mean, what's he supposed to do with this information? I mean, what does he do with it? And what's he left thinking about the man who's basically reared him and taken care of him, when God's basically said, this guy's responsible for it too. It says he did not rebuke them. he knew about it. And now we know that they warned him. I mean, it said he warned him, but according to at least God's feeling, this is not a rebuke. Warning somebody, telling somebody you know that they're doing something wrong and telling them even that they should not do it anymore is not the same as rebuking them. And as somebody pointed out, it's having consequences and punishing them yourself. So now God has to step in and do it. And again, as was said, there is no getting out of this. There's no warning that he can. It's not like you can say to Eli, you got to stop this from happening, or you got to get these guys out because, we have a chance. There's no chance. And that's what he's just been like. I mean, this is a bombshell, and it's a bombshell of like, well, what can I, like, why should I even say anything? Because nothing can be done. So notice here, I just wanted to show you, meaning of Hebrew uncertain. It says Septuagint reads against God at will. Well, if you read how his sons committed sacrilege against God at will. Now, so the Septuagint added the words against God. As I said, the Septuagint probably is, and that's why the note is there, probably has the correct text, or not the correct text, but maybe the original text, or closer to the original text. But it doesn't, I mean, you knew from the context what was meant there, right? That doesn't change what you got out of that. I mean, you knew what it meant. These guys had screwed up as priests. So that's my only point is I will show you the notes, and sometimes they're really critical. That one isn't. It's just one of the first. I think it maybe was the first one that we had where the Septuagint actually has the missing words, if you will. But like I said, it doesn't change at all what we read. That's why I'm not gonna go over it over. So let's read what Samuel now does.
Samuel lay there until morning, and then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to report the vision to Eli. But Eli summoned Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. And he answered, Here.
Now,
Hineni.
Exactly. Thank you. So he says, Hineni. Now, and look at how powerful that line is. That Eli calls Shmuel and says to him, Beni, my son. He calls him my son. He calls Samuel my son. It's almost the exact same words that Abraham says to his son Isaac, Beni. And the Hineni reminds us in some ways of that Akedah. And except in this case, it's almost as if the father's been bound and not the son. And again, the son is not the biological son, it's the spiritual heir and the one who is essentially taking over here. Samuel's Hineni is a really tough Hineni.
And Eli asked, What did he say to you? Keep nothing from me. Thus and more may God do to you if you keep from me a single word of all that he said to you. Samuel then told him everything, withholding nothing from him. And Eli said, He is the Lord. He will do what he deems right. Samuel grew up, and the Lord was with him. He did not leave any of Samuel's predictions unfulfilled.
So there, that little line there too, that Samuel Vayigdal Shmuel seems to indicate that Samuel was even younger than you might have thought. Like if you thought he was, a late, teen, early 20s, yeah, maybe, but he could have been even younger when this first happened. That God might have called him when he was a really young boy, in maybe 9 or 10.
It seems like he was young because he thought, it felt like it was his job to look after Eli at night.
Yeah.
It seems like a job for a boy.
Yeah. Well, he definitely seems to be, a little bit younger, naive, but, I guess the point here is that the younger he is, the more kind of amazing it is, because it means that God was talking to him from a really early age, right? So, God speaking to a child must have been a very special child. So there is that kind of like what's at stake here. But it also means that time elapsed, by the way, between when God spoke to Samuel and told him this and then what actually happens. Look, what can we take away from this? First of all, Eli kind of threatens him. And again, here's another one of those phrases it's going to say, meaning of Hebrew uncertain, or it says a formula of adjuration. Again, there might have been a word or two missing there. And then in here it says, well, whatever. I mean, that one's even a smaller little note, but the notes add up. I mean, the number of times where the Bible will say, where there'll be a footnote in Samuel is astounding. But the bottom line is Eli says it is what it is. It's the Lord's gonna do what the Lord's gonna do, and he's, at least, I mean, you can say he's accepting of it. He's he has to have the recognition that God is now going to exact the retribution against him for the fact that he couldn't do it. And God's going to do what God thinks right. And that's what the words are. I mean, literally what God, in God's eyes, that's what's hatov be'einav, what God thinks is what God sees to be right. So this is what's going to happen. At least in Eli's eyes, he's now doomed.
All Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was trustworthy as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord continued to appear at Shiloh. The Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh with the word of the Lord. Yeah,
it seems to be, again, maybe there's something missing here. Maybe there's like a word or two missing, because we don't really know what God said to Samuel, and maybe nobody knew exactly. We didn't have the exact words that happened, but that's not the end of God talking to Samuel. God talks to Samuel, and the way the Bible tells it, everybody in Israel knew. From Dan to Beersheba means, from California to New York, everybody knew that Samuel was trustworthy was a trustworthy prophet, that God was speaking to Samuel. And it wasn't just one time. It wasn't just about Eli's sons, that God, it continued to reveal himself to Samuel. And again, at this place, Shiloh. So that is the end of chapter 3, though is it really the end of chapter 3? Because the way the Hebrew maybe gives it to us, it wouldn't really be, and the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh with the word of the Lord, and Samuel's word went forth from all Israel, is the way that our verse ends, is the way our verse ends maybe originally. But the way the Christian scholars broke it, they had this as essentially a capital, and Samuel's word went forth to all Israel, and Israel marched out to engage the Philistines in battle. Now that's a critical difference, because if that line and Samuel's word, or that clause, right, if that part of the verse is part of the next verse, then it seems as though that Samuel encouraged Israel to go out to battle against the Philistines. That's not the way that we would kind of understand it, if it really goes with the previous verse, which is that and Samuel's word went forth from all of Israel, that people listened to Samuel, and that's the end of it. It's a very interesting break because it doesn't really make sense, given that this next part of the Bible doesn't seem to have anything to do with Samuel, in the sense that Samuel's not responsible for it. It definitely has consequences for Samuel and for the rest of Israel. But Samuel's not responsible for what happens in this next scene, the part of the Bible that we're going to read today, the last story that we're going to read. So the first story was arguably, again, this verse goes with that first story, but that's not the way the Christian editors and numerators of the Bible chapters and verses wanted it. They wanted Samuel in this next chapter. And I think it completely changes and actually obscures, and actually, I'll go further, it actually perverts what Samuel does. Because Samuel does not encourage the Israelites to go into battle against the Philistines. It's not, first of all, it doesn't seem to be his place yet to do that. He's not a leader at that level yet. And and I will say, we do see a difference, by the way, in Samuel between his role as a prophet and his role as a judge or a leader, a kingmaker, political leader. We do see a difference. Right now, they've just basically said that he's also kind of a judge, a political leader. So let's read chapter 4 and 5. That's what we're going to read today, which is the story of the war against the Philistines. So for our sake, Rosemary, why don't you start out with Israel marched out?
Israel marched out to engage the Philistines in battle. They encamped near Ebenezer, while the Philistines encamped at Aphek. The Philistines arrayed themselves against Israel, and when the battle was fought, Israel was routed by the Philistines, who slew about 4,000 men on the field of battle.
Yeah, that's not good. That's a
Crushing defeat.
it's not a good word. The word rout, that is means that there was no military gain or military achievement for the Israelites in this battle against the Philistines. We've read about the Philistines in the book of Judges already, in that they are oppressing the Israelites. Samson fights against them and is able to kill lots of Philistines and at least maybe make them back off a little bit, at least in their engagements with his tribe, the tribe of Dan. But they're our enemies, and they're living along the coastal cities of Ashdod and Ashkelon and Gaza. They also have some inland territories with Ekron, which is inland. And so we're pretty much from Tel Aviv down to Gaza was Philistine territory, and at different times would move inland and encroach into Judah and into the other tribes. And they were our enemies, as we're going to see. Very important in the book of Samuel as an enemy, and they're one of several enemies that Israel has. They're not the only enemy, but they're the coastal enemy. And the Philistines, again, are originally an Aegean people, Greek islands, Crete and Cyprus, and they settle in along the coast and along the Mediterranean coast. So Israel was never much of a Mediterranean. The Israelites were not a big maritime power on the Mediterranean or on the Red Sea. They're not. That's not the thing that Israel is known for. But the Philistines are, and the Phoenicians are in Lebanon. The Philistines and Phoenicians are not the same. They're different ethnically. They're different. They have different histories. The Phoenicians are Canaanite peoples. They are Semitic peoples, or close to. I mean, they speak a Semitic language, and their language, the Phoenician language, becomes the basis for Greek and Latin, and pretty much the alphabet for most of the Western world owes the Phoenicians their alphabet. But Israel kind of gets boxed out of the coast by the Phoenicians on the north and the Philistines in the south. They kind of keep the coastal territories to themselves. The irony, of course, today is that Israel is primarily the modern nation of Israel is more coastal, and the Israelis and the Jewish part of Israel, if you will, is more along the coast, and the more Arab and specifically now Muslim communities are in the inland. So it's almost reverse of the way Israel was in the period 3,000 years ago, because we're at 1000 BCE. It's almost a reverse of where it is today. And I kind of remind people of that because these cities that we read about that are Philistine cities are all really important cities for Israel today. Ashdod and Ashkelon are beautiful coastal cities that have been developed and are important for Israel's strength and really beautiful kind of cities now. But they were Philistine cities. And so we're going to read about them in the book of Samuel. We're going to read about them today. And this place here that they fight is interesting because it's Ebenezer. It's the word Ebenezer, which means rock of strength. And whether even Ebenezer, we had a discussion of whether Scrooge is Jewish because his name is Ebenezer. It is a definitely Hebrew word, but it's not used as a name in the Bible frequently, and it's not a place name that's very important either. Aphek is today not far from Tel Aviv, and so this was fairly inland, this battle, which indicates again that the Philistines were fighting us pretty far into the land of Israel. This is not along the coast. So this was not a good start to the battle or to the campaign. The first battle is not good. And here, what do we do now?
When the Israelite troops returned to the camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord put us to rout today before the Philistines? Let us fetch the ark of the covenant of the Lord from Shiloh. Thus he will be present among us and will deliver us from the hands of our enemies." So the troops sent men to Shiloh. There Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were in charge of the ark of the covenant of God, and they brought down from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of the hosts, enthroned on the cherubim.
Yeah. So without, reading the next few paragraphs, this does not look like it's going to be a recipe for success. Not least of which, there's no indication that God said, "Hey, why don't you take out my ark into battle today?" Now, again, we know that the Israelites were led by the Ark of the Covenant in the Torah. In the Bible, it says in Numbers that, when the ark went out into battle, that God would rout their enemies. It actually says that, right? We actually say that, by the way, when we open up the ark, when we open up the ark at services, we say, "Vayehi bin so Aharon Vayomer Moshe, Kuma Adonai ve'afutzu oivecha." Arise, God, and defeat your enemies. So we do that when we open the ark. We ask God to rout our enemies. It's a battle cry. So the idea of having the ark in battle isn't unheard of. This just doesn't seem to be anything that God has said, "Why don't you take out my ark into battle and I'll help you and be there with you?" So we already know this wasn't done with God's permission or encouragement. And we already know that the ark is now being cared for and it's now been taken care of, the responsible care of very irresponsible guys. Hophni and Phinehas were in charge of the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. So this is not a recipe for success, to put it mildly.
When the ark of the covenant of the Lord entered the camp, all Israel burst into a great shout, so that the earth resounded. The Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, and they wondered, "Why is there such a loud shouting in the camp of the Hebrews?" And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come to the camp, the Philistines were frightened, for they said, "God has come to the camp." And they cried, "Woe to us! Nothing like this has ever happened before."
Well, at this point, the psychological warfare aspect of this seems to be going in our favor. The Philistines, they hear what's happening when the ark comes, and now they're scared. because they believe that now God has come into their camp. So they are frightened by this. It says, woe to us. Oi. There's the word oi right there. That's the Hebrew word. Oi, woe. That's what oy vey means. Woe is me. Oy vey. So this is not a good thing for them, they think. So at least at first, it seems to be a good plan to bring the ark into the camp, at least the reaction that we get here.
Woe to us! Who will save us from the power of this mighty God? He is the same God who struck the Egyptians with every kind of plague in the wilderness. Brace yourselves and be men, O Philistines, or you will become slaves to the Hebrews as they were slaves to you. Be men and fight.
So what have they done? They have now taken this fear and they have turned it against, they've turned it now into a positive. They've now used their fear of what could happen now. And what does it say? We know this God. This is the God that did all that stuff to the Egyptians, hit them with all the plagues. That's a key element, by the way, is the Philistines know this. They don't have to be told. They know it. And this all goes in kind of conjunction with what God and with what Moses had said all throughout the Bible, which is that everybody knows God now as the God who punished the Egyptians. Like, this is part of God's PR. Like, people know this about God. God punished the Egyptians and they're afraid, because if the Egyptians can get hit, we definitely, as Philistines, we have no protection. So now they're scared. Now they're fighting for their lives. So now they've turned, they're the more powerful army. I mean, the Philistines have the more powerful army. They are worried now because of the consequences of what happens if they lose. And now, it's like when, I hate to use the example, but it's like when if you hear Michael Jordan talk about it, or Tom Brady, when they talk about how they fired themselves up, they know they're better than everybody else, but they actually have to make themselves in a situation where they think that they're going to lose, and they actually like create enemies against themselves so that they actually can get fired up. And it seems that the Philistines do that. They have a reason to be. They don't know that the power isn't there right now, that God hasn't, they don't know what's going on with the Israelites, but they do know that this could be a real enemy, and so they use it to fire themselves up. So they turned it into an inspiration. So the Philistines are now they're geared up.
The Philistines fought, Israel was routed, and they all fled to their homes. The defeat was very great. 30,000 foot soldiers of Israel fell there. The ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Pinchas, were slain.
So this is exactly what, God had foretold. So now not only has God's prophecy been now manifest, that Samuel heard, that Eli had heard from the man of God as well. I mean, this was a warning. There was warning. There was a prophecy. There was, then there wasn't even a warning. It's now happened. Now, what's interesting about it is that God has literally allowed God's own holy object to be captured in this. 30,000 Israelites died. 4,000 died in the first engagement. Now 30,000 more have died. This is a huge rout. Now, again, are these numbers inflated? We don't know, but if the book of Samuel was written closer to when the events happened, I mean, it's possible. Whatever happened, there were enough Israelites that went into battle here that it was a terrible destruction. And they probably had a decent amount of soldiers, because they wouldn't have brought out the ark unless they had, enough people to protect it. And whatever the engagement was, this was a complete disaster. And to top it all off, the ark is captured. The ark is captured. And essentially God is now, or some part of God is now in Philistine possession. Whatever power that ark has, And we saw what power the Ark has in Raiders of the Lost Ark. You saw what it can do. It's in the possession, if you will, of the Nazis right now. The bad guys have the Ark.
A Benjaminite ran from the battlefield and reached Shiloh the same day. His clothes were rent and there was earth on his head. When he arrived, he found Eli sitting on a seat waiting beside the road, his heart trembling for the Ark of God. The man entered the city to spread the news, and the whole city broke out in a cry. And when Eli heard the sound of the outcry and asked, "What is the meaning of this uproar?" the man rushed over to tell Eli.
And by the way, how many times have we seen this in literature? Well, I guess it depends if you read a lot of ancient Greek literature, but the motif of the guy running back from the battlefield, you know, the sole survivor or the lone footman who runs back to tell people what happened. This will be an important motif in the book of Samuel. It's one of the things that we see in Samuel that kind of reminds us of those Greek tragedies, or I wouldn't say even tragedies, but you know, the Greek tales. But this is the you know, in this case it says a Benjaminite. We've already read about the Benjaminites almost being wiped out in battle. Maybe you could say it kind of makes sense that the guy who survives is a Benjaminite. You know, he's a tough guy. He's you know, he's a you know, he's a you know, he's a guy who you know, the sole survivor, if you will. And he tells Eli what happened. So it's kind of Phidippides guy here. So here's what he says.
Now Eli was 98 years old. His eyes were fixed in a blind stare. The man said to Eli, "I am the one who came from the battlefield. I have just fled from the battlefield." Eli asked, "What happened, my son?" The bearer of the news replied, "Israel fled before the Philistines, and the troops also suffered a great slaughter. Your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the Ark of God has been captured."
So that's the news is horrific. It's the worst, you know, the worst news you could imagine. Everything bad happened. The Israelites lost. Your two sons are dead, and the ark's been captured. It's like everything bad had happened. Everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. And I will tell you, by the way, I was just looking at the difference between the Septuagint and the Bible version that we have, the MT, the Masoretic text. In the Masoretic text, it says that Eli is 98. We just read. In the Septuagint, it says he's 90. Is it a big difference? No, but it's you know, there's differences in the text that, again, they're not just you know, language. In some cases, the numbers and the dates are different. And it, you know, we don't know for sure which one's right, but no matter what, Eli is an old man when he's told this information.
When he mentioned the Ark of God, Eli fell backward off the seat beside the gate, broke his neck and died, for he was an old man and heavy. He had been a chieftain of Israel for 40 years.
Mm-hmm. So it says that he was a shofet, that he was a chief, which is, you know, essentially, again, the word we use for a judge. He had been a judge for in this case 40 years. Again, the Septuagint says 20 years, so there's a difference in those numbers as well. But that's I mean, 20 years or 40 years. I mean, 40 years definitely is a very significant amount of time that he was in power for. But yeah, he essentially died at hearing the news. I mean, it doesn't say he has a heart attack. It says he actually fell when he heard the news, and he dies when he falls. But there it is. His sons die and he dies on the same day. So the prophecy is fulfilled, but it's interesting that the way the Bible tells it, what really killed him was that the ark got captured. I mean, his son's dying was terrible, but it almost seems that Eli, in a moment of, like what finally did him in was that. And maybe it's the knowledge that, he'd already lost his sons. His sons were already gone. I mean, he knew it, he was told, but the fact that under his authority, under his life, in his lifetime, under his watch, the ark got taken. That did it. He fell off and he died. Bad. It's a very dramatic scene, very visually dramatic scene, which is what we have in Samuel throughout the book. Some of the most visually dramatic, literally almost, you have to, play it out in your head. You have to have the scene acted, in your mind to see it happen. That's not the end. That's actually not everything that happens. Look at this.
His daughter-in-law, the wife of Pinchas, was with child about to give birth. When she heard the report that the ark of God was captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she was seized with labor pains, and she crouched down and gave birth. As she lay dying, the women attending her said, "Do not be afraid, for you have borne a son." But she did not respond or pay heed. She named the boy Ichabod, meaning the glory has departed from Israel, referring to the capture of the ark of God and to the death of her father-in-law and her husband.
This is the birth of Ichabod. Yeah. It's another horrible thing that happens here to the family. This woman dies, Eli's daughter-in-law dies giving birth. That's what it says right here. Pinchas's wife. Now, the child does live, but he's given a name, Ichabod, which means no glory, no honor. It's not a good name. So when Washington Irving decided to name a guy Ichabod Crane, it's not a good name. For those who read the Bible, who would know the Bible, which was probably a lot more of his audience than the people who read the story, who know the story of the Headless Horseman today, Ichabod is not a good name. It's not a name, like, why would anybody be named Ichabod? It's, first of all, it sounds like even weird to our ears, but it is not a good name. It's a name that literally means devoid of glory. It's not a very common name. I mean, I haven't heard a lot of people named Ichabod. It is in the was chosen to be a name that was had this meaning, not double meaning. It's what the name is. We read about him later on. Well, we don't actually read about him later on, but we know that he was a guy and people knew him. So what is interesting about it is that he survives, and he's in some way a legacy of this horrible moment for his family, where his family screwed up and is now finally, well, his family screwed up before. His dad, we know, is not living a good life, but this is when he's born the day that they're finally held accountable for everything that they did. That's the day he was born. So he was a priest. I mean, he was from the priestly family. And this is his legacy. So again, we don't know much about him. It's not like we have a bunch of stories about him, but that's the day he was born. According to the Bible, his mother dies while he's born. His dad died, and he's born into a world where, his family's basically now been held accountable for all this bad stuff. It's a tough story. The last line actually is
When
oh yeah. This last line is
The glory is gone from Israel, she said, for the ark of God has been captured.
yeah. So her husband was dead, and that's terrible. She's gonna die. She's dying right now, but this is what is the thing that we have to now deal with. The ark has been captured. So this story, folks, that we read in chapters 4 and 5, and here's the important thing. It's not really about Samuel. That's why to include Samuel in the story by putting that last verse or the previous verse in the story it's not really fair to Samuel, because Samuel really had nothing to do with this. As a matter of fact, it's like, Samuel would say, keep me out of this. I had nothing to do with this. It wasn't my idea. It wasn't my authority. I didn't go. I didn't have anything to do with this. Samuel literally comes. I mean, this is the backstory for Samuel, and it also is important because when we read about the ark coming into Jerusalem later on, there's this kind of like in the back of our minds, if we remember this story, then we know why there needs to be a temple. We can't have an ark that we take out anymore. This ark isn't going out, into battle anymore. This ark's got to find a permanent home. It can't be in a temporary place. It can't be stolen. It can't be taken. The ark is too important. And so this story in chapter 4 and 5 really is a, counter and kind of like the foreshadowing to what we have later on with the ark. All right, so let's read this chapter, which is the amazing adventures of an ark, which I do want to say, it's very amazing, and it has nothing to do with what happens inside Israel, in the sense that, like, we're following the ark now, folks. If we're in the movie, now the visuals are on the ark. They're not with us in chapter 5. It's, by the way, that's unusual. Very rarely are we getting a view from the other side. And in this case, we're with the Philistines without Israelites. Interesting. All right, let's read what happens here.
When the Philistines captured the ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. The Philistines took the ark of God and brought it to the temple of Dagon, and they set it up beside Dagon.
And we read about Dagon, this god that they had. We read about him back in the story of Samson. This is their main god, Dagon, who is the god of fertility, and it's kind of like a Zeus. It's kind of like he's their big main deity, Dagon. As we said, it is also the word for grain, a Hebrew word for grain. So here is, and it says they brought it from Ebenezer, where they captured it, and they went to Ashdod, which is one of their main cities. There's 5 main cities for the Philistines. Ashdod, which is south of Tel Aviv, along the coast, modern day Israel. It's about it is got a marina and a port, and it is about 20 miles south of Tel Aviv, on the coast. It's the next big city, not city, big city, but it's a city. I mean, it's the next city below it. So it goes Ashdod, and then it goes Ashkelon, which is about another 5 miles south of from Ashdod, and then it goes to Gaza. So between Ashkelon and Gaza, you've got about 5-7 miles, 10 miles. That's pretty critical, because Ashkelon and occasionally Ashdod are hit by rockets from Gaza. Ashkelon is again 2.5, 3 miles from the actual border of Gaza, but from the main areas where the rockets are being launched, 5-7 miles away. It is a big target, Ashkelon, but Ashdod, occasionally things reach there, and even again as far north as Tel Aviv. So those are all along the coast: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and then you'd hit Tel Aviv, Yaffo. So Ashdod is the first stop for the ark on its pilgrimage. All right, so they put it up in the temple of Dagon.
Early the next day, the Ashdodites found Dagon lying face down on the ground in front of the ark of the Lord. They picked Dagon up and put him back in his place. But early the next morning, Dagon was again lying prone on the ground in front of the ark of the Lord. The head and both hands of Dagon were cut off, lying on the threshold. Only Dagon's trunk was left intact.
And again, meaning of Hebrew uncertain. It's another, again, the Septuagint doesn't tell us a huge amount other than, again, what we get from the context here, which is that the statue is desecrated and it seems pretty miraculous. They had one chance, the statue just gets knocked over. The next day, it's not just knocked over, the head and hands are cut off, and it's lying on the threshold. It's actually been moved considerably from where it just didn't come off a podium. It's actually now been moved. That's pretty wild, and they're freaked out by it. They're freaked out by this, the Ashdodites.
That is why, to this day, the priests of Dagon and all who enter the temple of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod. The hand of the Lord lay heavy upon the Ashdodites, and he wrought havoc among them. He struck Ashdod and its territory with hemorrhoids.
Yeah, this is a weird phrase. And again, notice here, the Septuagint reads differently from our Hebrew text. It also mentions mice swarming in the Philistine ships and invading their fields. And mice seems to be important because it is mentioned later on. And so it is perhaps more accurate to say that there is a couple lines maybe missing here, which also tell us that there wasn't just one thing that the Ashdodites dealt with. There were two things, mice and hemorrhoids. You don't want to have either one. I guess if you have both happening simultaneously, it's even worse. But it sounds a little bit like the Egyptians. And guess what? The Egyptian story is something that, as we said, the Philistines already knew. So this is not, it doesn't take them a long time to figure out this is a problem, right? So they know what God is capable of doing. And hemorrhoids and mice might be on the beginning end of many more plagues. By the way, if it's more than one plague too, it's kind of critical because it means that, you know, like right away they're being hit with multiple things that that are going to scare them. So hemorrhoids are, by the way, an interesting thing to get stuck with because it's basically saying, I'm going to get you in a place where it's not necessarily one that anyone would see, but you're going to be in a lot of discomfort. And so they are hit with, the Bible seems to be telling us, now there are different translations for this, by the way. Sometimes you'll notice that some translations translate this as tumors. It is possible that it's not hemorrhoids. No matter what, it's some type of bodily effect that is big enough, or, well, I don't want to ruin the end of the story for you, but there's a level to this where whatever it is important, what they get afflicted with. And it seems to be something that, again, could be excised, represented later, taken home in a, I don't know why you'd want to take it home in a bag, but that you could actually see it if it was put in a jar, that kind of thing. But this affects the people of Ashdod, which is one of the Palestinian cities. Excuse me, I said Palestinian Philistine cities. It's actually the same word, by the way. But the Plishtim, this is their first hit, if you will, the first city. And this is what they get hit with, this plague. So what are they going to do?
When the men of Ashdod saw how matters stood, they said, "The ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is dealt harshly with us and with our God Dagon."
Yeah, so it's not good for us. It's not good for our God. This is not, we can't have the ark. Can't have it. We don't want it.
They sent messengers and assembled all the lords of the Philistines and asked, "What shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel?" They answered, let the ark of the God of Israel be removed to Gath. So they removed the ark of the God of Israel to Gath. And after they had moved it, the hand of the Lord came against the city, causing great panic. He struck the people of the city, young and old, so that hemorrhoids broke out among them.
So it goes on to Gath, which is one of the other 5 cities. It's also an inland city. It's not that far inland from Ashdod and Ashkelon. It's actually a little bit closer to Ashkelon, depending on which. We have a place we call Kiryat Gat in Israel today. So it's a Jewish city. Kiryat Gat is named the village of Gath, but there's actually, we think the actual biblical Gath was a place we call Tel Tzafit, which is a little further north, a little bit closer to Ashdod, but it's about 6 miles inland is Gath. Gath is later important because that's where Goliath of Gath. That's where he's known from. So it's one of the 5 cities. It's also an inland city. So there's 2 inland cities, Gath and Ekron, and then the 3 coastal cities. So they sent it out. They sent it to the next city, to Gath. And it's not good in Gath either. Causes a great panic. And again, even though the Hebrew here seems to be missing a word, they get the same stuff. They get hemorrhoids.
Then they sent the ark to Ekron. But when the ark of God came to Ekron, the Ekronites cried out, "They have moved the ark of the God of Israel to us to slay us and our kindred." They too sent messengers and assembled all the lords of the Philistines and said, "Send the ark of the God of Israel away and let it return to its own place, that it may not slay us and our kindred." For the panic of death pervaded the whole city, so heavily had the hand of God fallen there. And the men who did not die were stricken with hemorrhoids. The outcry of the city went up to heaven.
Yeah, not good. And by the 3rd city, the Philistines are saying, "Get this thing out of our possession." They, and again, there seems to be a little bit of a sense that when they sent it inland, that, it started in Ashdod, which was one of the, the coastal cities, maybe a larger city, that they send it to the other cities to kind of get it out of their midst, let it be their problem. Well, it definitely seems to be like the city that gets it next is like, "Don't give us your problem. We don't want this either." So there seems to be a sense that maybe the cities are getting it out of their midst, and the next city that gets it goes, "I don't want it." And definitely by the 3rd time, they get the message, which is, we got to get this out of this. We're not supposed to have this. So, which then again, almost seems like the Philistines are doing God's work by themselves, by spreading it around their country. Wherever this ark is going, the people are getting struck with hemorrhoids, which is, look, there's some people who feel if there are mice that are coming with this, that maybe there's some kind of plague. That maybe, again, there's speculation that this is some kind of bubonic plague. Whatever it is, it's not good. And it says the panic of death was over these people. So if it was hemorrhoids, that's bad. But if it's bubonic plague, it's really bad. And remember, bubonic plague creates, sores. It creates those kinds of things. So if it's not bubonic plague, if it's not hemorrhoids, if it's anything that's spread by mice, that, or not by mice, but by the fleas that are on the mice, but whatever, the mice are the carriers. Is it creating this kind of plague situation where wherever the ark is going, this plague is following it? Now, the ark itself doesn't have the ability, it's made out of metal and wood. It doesn't have the ability to carry illness, but the power that it has definitely does. So they know it's not like the mice are in the ark, but they're following the ark, and they are God's. They know that this is a hand of God situation. So let's read what happens, and this is the last part of the story today.
The ark O Lord, remained in the territory of the Philistines 7 months.
That's a long time, folks. That's not a week, that's not a couple weeks. It's not even a month. For over half a year, the ark is among the Philistines doing this wherever it goes.
Then the Philistines summoned the priests and the diviners and asked, "What shall we do about the ark of the Lord? Tell us with what we shall send it off to its own place." They answered, "If you are going to send the ark of the God of Israel away, do not send it away without anything. You must also pay an indemnity to him. Then you will be healed and he will make himself known to you. Otherwise, his hand will not turn away from you."
Yeah, and let's just look at this note right here. Again, maybe there's a word or two missing, but you get the meaning, right? You better give some kind of tribute to God, because it's only in due respect to God that we're going to get this off of us. And
Isn't it interesting that Dagon said, you said it means wheat, right?
well, yes, it becomes the god. The god becomes associated with fertility and then with grain.
Well,
Yeah.
these are mice fighting against the grain. It's kind of a play on words.
Yeah, maybe, but originally, no. I mean, it doesn't have that same meaning in Hebrew. But there is this understanding that the god of fertility perhaps has been hit by mice, which is, mice are known for their reproduction, their multiplicitous reproduction, that they multiply like crazy and they feed on grain. So it could be that, again, the mice were chosen in particular because of Dagon and because of his association with grain and fertility. So that could be part of the play on there, is in the mice themselves. And maybe there's something with the hemorrhoids too that we don't even understand, that are attached to this, to Dagon, and maybe to the way Dagon was worshipped, and all these kinds of things. It's difficult for us to know the cultural plays that are going on here, but there definitely are some, and we'll just never know them. We'll never, I mean, I'd say never, but unless we get some amazing archaeological find, we're not going to know what exactly happened with the Philistines.
It's also kind of interesting that they don't take on our God. I mean, their God's was thrown to the floor, and they don't, and they acknowledge that he's greater. Our God is greater, but they don't. This is still the God of the Hebrews.
Yep.
The Philistines still have their own. So there are other gods, but this is particularly our God of our culture, and that's your God.
Yep. And what we see here when the Philistines do this, penance, if you will, that we have is that there is this understanding that, what do? They go to their priests and diviners, which is what the Egyptians did too, right? The Egyptians went to their magicians and their priests to try to figure it out. And their priests in Egypt had said, look, this is God. We don't have any power over God. And they essentially the Egyptians didn't stop worshiping their gods, even though they had to recognize that God was the most powerful. That it shows you that people didn't stop worshiping the way that they were worshiping just because they saw God do these miracles. Now, we do have cases where that does happen, right? In the story of Jonah, the ship captain and the crew, they become followers of God because they see it. We also have other people in the Bible, Naaman and other people, who see God's miracles, and then they pick up that religion. I mean, Ruth does it without even having to need to see a miracle. But yeah, we see the opposite, which is that people see the power of God, the hand of God, and yet, I'm still okay with Dagon. But you're right. Naturally you would say, well, wait a second, you just prove that your God was worthless, and that's what that scene does. It actually proves that their God's worthless, and that what they're going to do is they are going to try to figure out a way to be healed, because at least at this stage they are not going to be they're not healed yet. They need to get healed. So they're actually not just trying to figure out like theological reasons for this. you and I can say, well, let's worship the right now. They just got hemorrhoids. They want to get rid of the hemorrhoids, right? I'm in pain and I got to get rid of this. And so they're trying to figure out how to get this out. And as Judith has said, it's biblical preparation H. The preparation H in this case is how do we prepare the ark to get it back to them so that God will get rid of this plague on us. And so they understand that even if they give the ark back, that might not mean we're healed. So we better do something. We must pay something for what we did by taking the ark. And so it's not just enough to return it. We have to pay a penalty. That's what the word indemnity means here. We have to pay a penalty to get this off of us. So let's read what that penalty will be, which is bizarre, but it's one of the most bizarre things in the Bible. Most bizarre items. Yes.
They asked, what is the indemnity that we should pay to him? They answered, 5 golden hemorrhoids and 5 golden mice, corresponding to the number of lords of the Philistines, for the same plague struck all of you and your lords.
Right. So there the mice make the appearance again, which means that, is it possible that there weren't mice at first? It wasn't part of the plague. It's possible. And some people say the 5 mice are in addition to the 5 golden hemorrhoids, because the Philistines are basically saying that we're like mice compared to you, God, that the mice represent them. The 5 definitely represent the Philistines. It says so, the corresponding to the number of lords of the Philistines. So this Philistine Pentapolis, as we call it, the 5 Philistine city states, have all been hit with it by this point. So it actually says that all of them have been hit. The 5 golden hemorrhoids is arguably the most unusual item in the Bible. If people were saying, what is the craziest thing that's mentioned in the Bible that, somebody would have, what's the craziest item in the Bible? A golden hemorrhoid probably is number 1 on the list. I can't really think of anything else that's as bizarre as a golden hemorrhoid, but that's what it says. So again, maybe it's a tumor. We don't know. The idea that somehow you can make a physical representation in gold of a hemorrhoid is, I don't know what to tell you. When people say, is it an interpretation? No, it's not interpretation. That's what the Bible said. It actually uses that word. The mice, seem kind of cute. That seems like something you'd see at Disneyland, a golden mouse. That's like the ultimate Disney idol, is the golden mouse. But no, it's there next to the golden hemorrhoids. And so this is their tribute. This is their way of saying, we're sorry. We're giving you these golden representations of what you've hit us with, which, I guess makes sense. It's not, there's a logic to it. God, we kind of understand we screwed up, and we are going to buy you off, if you will, and say, whatever we have to do, we're going to do. As Francine just texted me too, that Joey, her son Joey, who we want to again remind everybody recently became engaged. We're very proud. But a few years ago, he was living in Ashdod and living on the coast. Ashdod and Ashkelon are, again, cities where there's a lot of immigrants. There's a lot of people that are there from Ethiopia and from former Soviet Union. Are living in those cities, and they are cities that Israel is trying to get people not just to live in Tel Aviv, trying to develop those cities. And Ashkelon actually has not a huge, but a large proportion, high proportion of Jews from South Africa and England, because it was actually built by, designed by South African Jews. Ashkelon was, that wanted to make it like a garden city in South Africa, and some of the garden cities there with, nice gardens and nice streets and things like that. So that is those cities of the Philistines, which are now Israelite cities today, Israel cities of people. So let's give them the hemorrhoids and the mice.
You shall make figures of your hemorrhoids and of the mice that are ravaging your land. Thus you shall honor the God of Israel, and perhaps he will lighten the weight of his hand upon you and your gods and your land. Don't harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts. As you know, when he made a mockery of them, they had to let Israel go, and they departed.
Wow. So there's a caution there too. Don't be like the Egyptians. Their leaders, the Philistine priests, said, don't be like the Egyptians, because it could be much worse. You could wind up losing your power over the Israelites too. So there's this kind of idea here that not only are they trying to give the ark back and make amends to God, they're trying to achieve this all at the same time that they don't want to give up their power over the Israelites, which seems to be a very difficult thing to do, but yet they're trying. The Philistines are trying to not wind up like the Egyptians. This is the precarious position that the Philistines are enjoying, where they still want to keep their political power, but they don't want to upset the God of the people that they're occupying. Kind of a weird idea, but it's one that they are seem very serious about. Philistines don't seem to be joking around.
Therefore, get a new cart ready and 2 milk cows that are not born of yoke. Harness the cows to the cart, but take back indoors the calves that follow them. Take the ark of the Lord and place it on the cart, and to put next to it in a chest the gold objects you are paying him as indemnity. Send it off and let it go its own way.
Okay, so there you got the gold, the gold objects, but we also have to be very careful with the way that we send it off. Who's going to bring it back? Whose job is it going to be to take this back? Well, they come up with an interesting idea. And this seems to be very carefully thought out. You take 2 cows, and they're not just any cows, they're cows that have calved, they've already calved. And you have the harness on them, though they're not harnessed, they've never been harnessed before. They're not like that kind of cow, that kind of bull. And they're going to take the ark back alone, with nobody on top of them, nobody riding them, nobody hitting them from behind, none of that. And let it go on its own. And that's crazy, because that's basically saying we're going to send it back in a miraculous way. We're going to let the cows go off, and they're going to go on a path, and it's going to take it back.
Then watch. If it goes up the road to Beth Shemesh, to his own territory, it was he who inflicted this great harm on us. But if not, we shall know it was not his hand that struck us. It just happened to us by chance. The men did so. They took 2 milk cows and harnessed them to the cart and shut up their calves indoors.
Yep. So
it'd be miraculous that the cows didn't just hang around where the calves were.
Exactly. And so this is to some extent going to be proof that this was God's hand, right? So if it walks back to Israelite territory, then it 100% was God doing it. So this is actually a little bit, as they acknowledge, a little bit of a test. We're going to see, let's make sure even that this is what, this is God that did this. And so if it walks up to Beth Shemesh, which is the first Israelite town, and again, Beth Shemesh is very close to the Philistine territory, and it's under Philistine, it seems like most of Israel is under Philistine control, but it's like that's a Israelite city, Israelite village, whatever. It's going to be Israelite territory. We read about it in the Samson story. It's probably even more under Philistine control than any other city, because it's the closest city to their territory. It's the first place that Philistines would go when they're coming in to seize tribute. If they got lazy one day and just said, you know what, we're only going to go to Beit Shemesh and just take grain and stuff from those people and their livestock. So it was probably not an easy place to live if you were an Israelite. But if the ark goes there, then we know that this is a miracle. Indeed, God was doing this. Yep. And by the way, part of this, I just want to say, part of this whole thing with the calves is that if the cow is going away from its calves and doesn't try to stay with its calves, then it really is like God is leading these cows, because the cows would naturally want to be near their calves, but we're not going to, we're going to see what happens. It's going to walk away, and this is what happens.
They placed the ark of the Lord on the cart together with the chest, the golden mice, and the figures of their hemorrhoids. The cows went straight ahead along the road to Beth Shemesh. They went along a single high road, lowing as they went and turning off neither to the right nor to the left. And the lords of the Philistines walked behind them as far as the border of Beth Shemesh.
So it worked. I mean, they go like
Another sign.
Yep, they're on autopilot. They go right to where they're supposed to go. It's clear that they're not, they don't even move to the right or left. They're going straight to Beit Shemesh. And the Philistines are first walking behind them until they get to the border of Beit Shemesh.
The people of Beth Shemesh were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley. They looked up and saw the ark, and they rejoiced when they saw it. The cart came into the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh, and it stopped there. They split up the wood of the cart and presented the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. A large stone was there, and the Levites took down the ark of the Lord and the chest beside it containing the gold objects and placed them on a large stone. Then the men of Beth Shemesh presented burnt offerings and other sacrifices to the Lord that day.
Yay, the ark is back home. Seems like everything's really good. We got the ark back. It's in Beit Shemesh. It's back in Israelite control. We sacrifice the cows. Everything's good. We got the ark back. Everything's good. The story doesn't end there. So I will just tell you, there's a couple more verses. And we're going to finish up with this. This is the story. The ark is back, and it seems like everything's good. Beit Shemesh, by the way, today is a very interesting city. It has been developed over the years as a city for Orthodox folks, but it's also got a non-Orthodox community. And there's been a lot of tension in Beit Shemesh over the years between the Orthodox and non-Orthodox communities there. But it has, it's a new city. It was not like a Palestinian controlled city that, whatever it was, it wasn't disputed in that sense. It's in Israel. And Jamie Geller, by the way, lives there. For any fans of Jamie Geller's kosher cooking, she's an American Jew who became religious and moved to Israel, and she does a lot of cooking stuff, Jamie. So she lives in Beit Shemesh. And in 2012, we found a seal in Beit Shemesh of a man fighting a lion, which goes back to about the 12th century, which is interesting because that's where Samson, was in that area. And there's a story of Samson fighting a lion. So might not be the earliest representation of a biblical story. It's hard to know for sure, but it's very coincidental that it was found in that town. And so Beit Shemesh is an important city in Israel today. And again, there's a lot of discussion about it because of some of the tension between the religious, the Haredi and the Hasidic community and the non-Hasidic, in some cases, modern Orthodox communities, which also sometimes there's tension even within the Orthodox community there in Beit Shemesh. But it is here where the ark is, and we're going to finish up with this weird story of what happens. The ark is in our possession, but that doesn't mean it's all roses.
The 5 lords of the Philistines saw this and returned it the same day to Ekron. The following were the golden hemorrhoids that the Philistines paid as indemnity to the Lord. For Ashdod 1, for Gaza 1, for Ashkelon 1, for Gath 1, for Ekron 1. As for the golden mice, their number accorded with all the Philistine towns that belonged to the 5 lords, both fortified towns and unwalled villages, as far as the great stone on which the ark of the Lord was set down to this day in the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh.
Yeah, and
The
as you can see, there, there's a little, there's differences in the text, but it's not that difficult to understand. And again, maybe the point of it is the mice actually also represented the other towns that were part of the Philistine community. But the ark is there, but that's not the end of the story.
The Lord struck at the men of Beth Shemesh because they looked into the ark of the Lord. He struck down 70 men among the people and 50,000 men. The people mourned, for he had inflicted a great slaughter upon the population. And the men of Beth Shemesh asked, who can stand in attendance on the Lord, this holy God? And to whom shall he go up from us?
Yeah, so it's kind of a strange phrase that God killed 70, and it says among the people, and 50,000 men. It's a bad emendation or bad version that we have. It probably is that he struck down 50,070 people. Why? Because if it's 70 people, it probably wasn't a great slaughter. According to this, lots of people died when they messed around with the ark that were Jewish, maybe more than died in the Philistine community. And so Beit Shemesh does not know what to do once they have the ark. So it was bad when it was amongst the Philistines, but it is continuing to wreak destruction as it makes its way into Israel. The people of Beit Shemesh are Jewish. Israelite. Here's what it says.
And the men of Beth Shemesh asked, who can stand in attendance on the Lord, this holy God? And to whom shall he go up from us? They sent messengers to the inhabitants of Kiryat Yearim to say, the Philistines have sent back the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it into your keeping.
And that is kind of where we'll read one paragraph into chapter 7, actually 2 paragraphs in chapter 7, and that's where we're going to end for today.
The men of Kiryat Yearim came and took up the ark of the Lord and brought it into the house of Adinav on the hill, and they consecrated his son Eleazar to have charge of the ark of the Lord. A long time elapsed from the day that the ark was housed in Kiryat Yearim, 20 years in all, and all the house of Israel yearned after the Lord.
Yeah, and so this is the end of this story, and it shouldn't really end in the beginning of another chapter of chapter 7, but this is where a natural break would be, which is that the ark is now in Kiryat Yearim, which means the village of the woods, if you will, Kiryat Yearim. And again, we're not exactly sure where Kiryat Yearim are, but we're pretty sure where it is, a little further north and towards Jerusalem than where we are at Beit Shemesh. But the point is that the ark first comes to rest in Beit Shemesh and it causes disaster there. And then it comes to Kiryat Yearim and it finds a place where it could, where it could be at peace. And again, this guy, Aminadav and his son Eleazar ended up be the caretakers of it, and things seem to go better after that. The yearned after here again, it seems to be maybe again a word or two missing, but the basic understanding here is that people are starting to do the right thing. Look, the ark got taken away. That story in chapters 4, 5, and 6 are kind of the root of what we read today, the kernel of that story. It's really devoid of Samuel completely. I mean, I really don't understand how anybody could try to connect it to say that Samuel was involved in that story. I mean, some people say like he's in the back. He's not there. He's not mentioned. if you add that last line that we had, then maybe he's mentioned, but it doesn't seem to warrant that. At least in Jewish tradition, it doesn't seem to be that he has anything to do with that scene. But it does set up why Samuel kind of essentially takes over in this vacuum of Eli dying and the ark being taken, which was a terrible situation. And so Samuel kind of, takes over in that at that time. So this is the background of Samuel. This is more of like the information, the prologue, if you will, to Samuel now taking over. So we read in the first couple of chapters about Samuel, his birth, his his tutelage, and kind of being in the house of Eli a little bit. We got that background. And now when we get into chapter 7 and really into chapter 8, we're going to see Samuel on his own. There is not a lot about Samuel on his own. I will tell you that. The book is called the Book of Samuel, and in the first 11 chapters or so, there is no King Saul, there's no King David, there's none of the other great characters that we're going to read about in the book of Samuel, or the books of Samuel. But we are left with kind of this understanding of Samuel, of who he was, why he came about, the world that he came about, and kind of helps us understand why we're going to have a king of Israel. Because to some extent, we never want to have the ark taken again. We never want to be in that kind of powerlessness again, where we're not only like searching for political leadership, we don't have our God is essentially our religious cult site has been stripped of its power. And so this is the background from, that we read about. And this is kind of why we have a king, why we're going to have a king, to prevent this exact thing from happening. And this is the world that Samuel, takes over in a time when Israel was not powerful, when they were at the mercy of the Philistines and maybe some other people. And this is kind of a low point, if you will, for the Israelites. I mean, these were people who came out of Egypt and were led into the promised land by Joshua. And how did we get to this low point? The book of Judges, and now the first 7 or so chapters of Samuel have told us we were at a very bad place.
We also see there's a lot of conflict between tribes. They're not getting along. They're slaughtering each other.
Well, we saw that in the book of Judges. We see that they have no clue. And by the way, the fact that when the ark comes to Beit Shemesh and they open it up or they try to mess around with it, I mean, like how messed up is this that the people don't even know what they're supposed to do with the ark when they get it? So it's really bad. It's not a good situation for us.
They did call a Levite, didn't they? They did call.
Well, we'll read what they did in the first place, right? It says they looked into it.
Oh, okay.
They looked into it. They looked into the ark of the Lord. This was, I mean, how can you, I mean, they had no idea what to do. Or they had no idea that that's not what you do with the ark. And again, we know that because we saw Raiders of the Lost Ark, and we know what happens when you open up the ark. You're going to melt. It's not a good place. And the story will start to flip. And we're going to next week, when we read in chapter 7, when we read about this new flip and what happens here, it's a really important chapter, what we read next week, because it's about the bigger issues of leadership. And as Judith just texted me, that we don't read this part, the golden hemorrhoids part, we don't read as a haftarah. We do not read it in the Bible, but we do read the next part, the part that we're going to read next week. We do read it as a haftarah, and it really, as Americans, really touches us because it's about leadership, and it's about essentially deciding on a king and understanding that when you put yourself under the authority of an individual, not a concept, but an individual, what we are losing and what's at stake when that happens. And so that's the really, really powerful part of the book of Samuel, which I think inspired the Jewish people for a really long time. And I do believe inspired Americans to try to create a system where we wouldn't be placing ourselves underneath an individual, but underneath a covenant and a concept and an idea, which I believe is articulated in the book of Samuel, probably the earliest representation of democracy and what is at stake when we try to make sure that we don't put ourselves under the authority of a person, but of a system. So with that, folks, I ask that you all stay healthy, that you all, again, hopefully take care of each other and don't be scared, even in the sense that we have things that frighten us and we have things we need to prepare for, that we are not, we're not fearful. And that, again, we live in a great country, and one that the sun just came out, at least in my, as I'm looking out the window right now, the sun just came out. So
yeah, I think we can see your house now, Rabbi.
So it started out with another kind of not really bright day, and hopefully it'll be a bright day. So go out and have a great day, everybody. Thanks for being here. And again, everybody stay healthy.
Rabbi Mark,
Stay strong. Yeah, Sandy.
I'm gonna, I don't know if you saw the email from USC Hillel, but it was very interesting because they have a letter that Carol Foltz, the new, or she's not that new, but the president of USC, sent to them about the anti-Semitic issues on the campus there. I can forward that to you.
When
I
did she
think I
send it
sent-
out? Before or after the attempted hostage?
Oh, no, it was before. It was, I think it was last week, but
Oh,
they
yeah, no,
have
I
a
saw-
lot of issues.
I saw
on the
that. I
campus.
thought maybe they said something else because
No.
USC has had a big problem lately with how to respond to anti-Semitism. And again, maybe this was a little bit more of a needed wake-up call to people to remind them that that it's ridiculous, because again, the fact that even the FBI originally said that it had nothing to do with anti-Semitism or it was not a targeted attack. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to get into it, but I was shocked and upset deeply that, are you kidding me? The synagogue was chosen. How many churches, how many other buildings did the guy have to go? I mean, they apologized. I didn't apologize, but they backtracked afterwards and said that, they misspoke. But yes, I mean, that was one of the sad things that happened for me, to see people not claim that this was an anti-Semitic chosen because it's Jewish. I mean, that was ridiculous. So anyways, I will, on a happier note, again, everybody stay healthy, stay positive. Thanks everybody for being here.
See you tomorrow.
All right. We'll see you tomorrow
Bye-bye.
for Torah
Thank
study.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Rosemary.